Hey friends, welcome back. It's Sound Guy Barry. I was recently asked what I thought was a terrific question, which is how do I like to set up the output side of the sound system? And to give a little bit of an explanation about auxiliary fed subs. Now my preference in how I like to run the sound system is in stereo, even though my band mix is relatively monaural. Typically when I mix a band, all of the instruments are panned more or less to the center. Now, if I have a guitar over here and a guitar over here, I might pan them separately just a little bit toward their stage position, but nothing too terribly extreme because I want everybody in the audience, even those folks in the audience who are sitting off to the side, to be able to get a pretty good representation of the band, and I don't want them to be lacking in any of the signal sources that are up on stage. So everybody is panned more or less to the center with maybe just a little bit of shift left or right depending upon what their stage position is, so that the folks in the middle of the audience get a audio picture that matches what they're seeing up on stage, but nothing too extreme. However, the effects, such as the vocal reverb effects, I patch into the system in a stereo mode, which gives a big, wide, spacious sound field, and I think that yields the nicest sounding results. So if it's my choice, I'll run the system in stereo. Now, of course, this is not a deal breaker. One of the systems that I work with on a regular basis is set up as a three-way mono system. So there's just a single feed coming out of the mixing board, which is a composite of all of the audio. It gets split by a crossover and drives the PA speakers mono three ways. So it is. And we produce just fine sounding shows there, but that's not my preference. My preference would be to run stereo, primarily for the impact it has on the vocal effects. So you get that nice, wide, spacious sound. The other thing that I like to do is to run auxiliary fed subs. Now, the reason for doing this is to provide a cleaner, clearer band sound with more defined bass. And this is a really easy thing that you can do in the configuration of your system, which I think yields significant improvements in the sound. Now, as you know, when we are miking instruments with the band, we always put the microphones up close to the sound source. We'll put this right against the guitar amplifier, for example, because we want the microphone to pick up just the guitar amplifier and not all of the other extraneous noises and sounds that are in the vicinity. And likewise, when we're doing vocals with the band, we get right on top of the vocal mics and sing directly into them for the same reasons. We don't want to pick up a bunch of background noise. We want the signal that's going into the microphone to be well above the noise. So we're trying to achieve the highest signal-to-noise ratio. Likewise, when we adjust the input gains on our preamplifiers, we ask the musicians to do a sound check and give us some audio, and we will turn up the gain on the input preamplifiers basically as much as we can, so that we can get the signal levels as loud as possible without them peaking and distorting the preamps. And of course, we'll give ourselves a little bit of headroom, 6 to 10 dB perhaps, just so that we can handle any unanticipated peaks without the input stage distorting. But we want the signals in the system to be as loud as possible over the noise. And so the purpose of auxiliary fed subs is to keep all of the extraneous noises out of our subwoofers. For example, we could have vocal microphones that pass through the mixing board, and we know that there is no significant bass in the vocals, probably nothing significant under about 100 hertz, unless you're Barry White's larger brother or something. But for most of us, there's no program content that's really got a lot of deep bass in the vocals. Same thing for guitars, same thing for snare drum, many of the toms on the kit. Many instruments do not actually have deep bass that's usable in the instrument. And by putting this microphone into the subwoofers, it's not going to do us any good. It's just going to do us harm by adding background noise and rumble and garbage into our woofers. Now, of course, there are some instruments that absolutely do need to go into our subwoofers, which would be things like bass guitar and kick drum and synthesizer keyboards, maybe a little bit of acoustic guitar. And for those instruments, we need to make sure that they do feed the subwoofers, whereas the other inputs, like our vocal microphones, we don't want any of that going into the subwoofers. So this is fairly easily achieved by using aux-fed subs. And how we do that is with our mixing board. Let's assume we have a digital mixing board and we're using powered loudspeakers. We would hook up our tops to the left and right output of the digital mixer. And then we take a sub channel which would be attached to one of our auxiliary outputs, just like our stage monitors would be. But the difference between the stage monitors and the aux-fed sub bus is that the stage monitors are set up on those auxiliary sends that are in a pre-fader mode, so that your main fader on your board, as you move it up and down on various channels, has no effect whatsoever on the amount of signal that goes out to your stage monitors for the musicians. Because if you were adjusting the show and that was also adjusting their stage monitors, that would be pretty disconcerting for the folks up on stage. So we want those things to be set up in a pre sort of mode, pre-fader configuration. However, for the auxiliary bus that is feeding our subwoofers, we want that to be in a post-fader configuration. So on your mixing board, under this auxiliary send, we just select post-fader. And that way, the signals that are coming through the main board, such as your bass guitar, as you operate the main fader, that will adjust their output going to the left and right buses to your mains, but it will also adjust the amount of output going into this auxiliary send channel that you're using to drive your subwoofers. And so you pick a channel, let's just say channel 6 for your subs, and on all of the inputs that actually need subwoofer output, things such as bass guitar, kick drums, keyboards, the larger floor toms, some acoustic guitar, that sort of thing, we'll just dial up some send off of those channels to go out to, in this case, auxiliary bus number 6, and that bus will be set up in a post-fader configuration. So now, as you push up the faders on the board, on your main faders, the output to the left and right mains will be adjusted, and also the output to the subs will track right along with it. You can adjust the amount of energy you push into the subwoofers on each of these channels by dialing up or dialing down the amount of bus that you're driving into that, like bus number 6, which is driving your subwoofers. And you can operate the main bus control to control the overall level of the subwoofers versus the main loudspeakers. Now, by doing this, it means that the signals that are coming off of your vocal microphones have no way of reaching the subwoofers. And so it keeps that background noise and rumble that might be being picked up by those microphones to just cuts them out of the subs. So the subs are only reproducing those instruments that actually need that kind of reinforcement and nothing else. Gives you cleaner, clearer, better sounding bass. Obviously, if you were using a more old school PA system, there's some minor changes. In this case, the left and right outputs of the mixer would probably go into an equalizer. So you can adjust the house EQ, and then out of that equalizer would go into a stereo crossover, and the crossover would then split out the high frequencies and the low frequencies into separate feeds, which would go to their own respective amplifiers and drive those portions of the loudspeaker system. So very likely you would have a crossover that would either just cut out the low frequencies and drive everything that's above 100, 120 hertz or so into your main loudspeakers, or maybe it would split it two ways, where it would have the low frequency channel, which would be above 100 hertz and less than, say, a kilohertz, and that would drive the the speaker in the mains, and then you'd have another channel, the high frequency side, which would be like 1.5 kilohertz or so on up to 20K, which would drive the horns. That would be pretty typical. So you might have some filtering there to drive your main loudspeakers. And then you have the auxiliary bus, which is going to be used to drive your subwoofers on the mixer. Let's call that bus 6 again. And so you'd have a feed coming out of that, which again I would put into an equalizer so you can EQ the subwoofers. And then out of that EQ, you go into a separate crossover, because we have to keep all these signals separate from each other. So you have another crossover, which would be a high cut filter or a low pass filter, which cuts out all of the content above 100 hertz, 150 hertz. So only the subwoofer content gets pushed out. Then that goes into an amplifier that drives the subwoofer boxes. So a pretty straightforward setup. Like I say, if you're using a kind of an old school system, you're going to need to have two separate crossovers. Of course, their mains would be a stereo crossover and the subs could be mono crossover, but you need a low pass filter for your subs and a high pass filter for your tops. Now, if you're using a digital mixing board, some of the digital mixing boards include crossover filtering capability right in their equalizer sections, and that's perfectly fine. The Behringer X32, for example, has 18 dB per octave filters you can just punch in on those channels, and that works. Now, one of the downsides of doing that, I would think, is that doing all of your filters in software may not be quite as safe as having a mechanical box sitting right there. I mean, if you overlook the settings or go roaming in there, you could undo those filters. And if you take off the high pass filter on your mains and drive your mains with full spectrum material, it's possible that you'd be putting too much energy into them and actually damage some speakers. But so just something to keep in mind is make sure that the filters are properly in place before applying power to stuff. But that's my preference. And like I say, none of the stuff is a showstopper. I work with all sorts of different systems that I encounter. And if I have an opportunity to make an adjustment, make a change, I'll set up the system in a form that is stereo with auxiliary fed subs. I think it gives you the best possible sound. But I work with other systems like this one that I mentioned, where it's a mono system and it's just a three-way split and doesn't give me that kind of control. And we still do fine shows. But I think if you haven't tried it, you should check out using auxiliary fed subs. It's how most of the larger shows are set up. And even for bar band shows, it will improve the sound of your low end and give you a cleaner, tighter, better sounding show, in my opinion. So that's my preference. Anyway, I appreciate the question. I hope that you found it interesting. And I appreciate you stopping by and checking out another episode of Sound Advice. If you would be so kind as to subscribe, thumb up the video, I think that would be really cool. And I'll catch you again soon on another episode. My name is Barry. I'm a sound engineer in the Minneapolis, St. Paul, Twin Cities area. I'd love to help you out with sound if you have any questions or need some advice, or you need a sound engineer to mix your show. So look forward to seeing you again on another upcoming episode. Thanks for stopping by.